I never thought my marriage would end like this. One moment I was a devoted husband and father. Then, with a single discovery, my entire world shattered. But what I did next, no one saw coming. A hard truth unfolding. I was down in the basement, focused on finishing the recreation room I had promised my 15-year-old daughter, Emily. The ceiling and walls were already done, and I had built a small storage space under the stairs. Now I was laying down the indoor-outdoor carpet I had picked up the night before. It felt good to make progress, and with my wife, Laura, away in Cleveland visiting her mother, I had the entire house to myself to work without distractions. Emily was out with friends and I had all the time I needed. My career as a corporate attorney had kept me busy over the years, but recently, I had stepped away from courtroom work. Our firm had a team of young, ambitious lawyers eager to prove themselves, all hoping for the rare opportunity to make partner. I spent most of my time mentoring them, guiding them through the complexities of corporate law, and letting them carve their own paths. My colleague, Margaret, handled much of the litigation, allowing me to focus on the bigger picture. Parenthood had been an adventure of its own, but Emily was enough for both Laura and me. At the time, we never really discussed having more children, especially since our marriage had been going through a rough patch. It wasn't the kind of relationship struggle that happened overnight, it was the slow, creeping kind that built up over time, making decisions like expanding our family feel impossible. Laura's parents lived in Cleveland, and we used to visit them twice a year as a family. Sometimes Laura would go on her own or take Emily with her, though it had been well over a year since either Emily or I had gone along. If I remembered correctly, the last time Laura visited, it was for her father's health concerns. I never resented her trips back home, but this time was different. It wasn't just another casual visit, it came after nearly a year of tension between us. Things had gotten noticeably worse after her last trip. Since returning, Laura had been distant, critical, and quick to find fault in everything I did. Each day seemed to bring a new demand, another task she insisted I handle, followed by sharp words if I didn't act fast enough. It was frustrating, confusing, and honestly hard to believe how much things had changed between us. The night before she left for Cleveland, she packed her bags and went to bed early. The next morning, she called a cab to the airport without waking me. No goodbye, no last-minute instructions, nothing. It was like I was just an afterthought. And as for our intimacy? That had been gone for years. We hadn't been close in that way for at least 2 years, certainly not since she lost her job 18 months ago. Looking back, I couldn't help but wonder if that was when everything had truly started unraveling. I knew it had been at least 6 months since Laura and I had been intimate before she made her last trip home, and even longer since we had any real closeness. At the time, I had told myself that stress was weighing on her, that maybe she was going through something she didn't know how to talk about. One night, she broke down in tears, saying she didn't understand why she was acting the way she was. She begged me to be patient, promised she would seek help, and for a brief moment, I believed her. I still remember sitting on the edge of the bed, taken aback by the rawness in her voice, watching as she quietly gathered her things and moved into the spare bedroom. But the very next morning, it was as if that moment of vulnerability had never happened. She was back to her usual sharp remarks, her distant stares, her endless criticisms. And that brings us to today. Laura had been gone for a day and a half now, and I had spent most of my time working on the basement. I was on my third trip down the stairs carrying 2 boxes when my foot slipped. I barely managed to grab the railing, but the boxes tumbled from my hands, crashing onto the floor. The cardboard split open, spilling their contents across the freshly laid carpet. Thankfully, there was nothing fragile inside, so I exhaled in relief and went back upstairs to grab a couple of empty boxes. As I bent down to repack everything, something caught my eye, a small bundle of letters, worn and held together with a frayed ribbon. It was clear that these letters had been cherished. The edges were tattered, the creases deep from being read and reread. And they weren't mine. A strange feeling settled in my stomach as I carefully unfolded the top letter and began to read. My darling Laura, I can't stop thinking about the last night we spent together. You drove me crazy, it was almost too much to bear. When you stopped, I wanted to cry. The way you made love to me was blissful. I know I won't stop thinking of you as you leave me to return to your loveless marriage. Why won't you leave him and come to me? My heart pounded as I flipped through the rest of the letters. They were all from the same man and all from the time she had taken that last trip home. Piece by piece, the truth fell into place. She had met him midway through her visit and extended her stay to be with him for the last weekend. His name was Daniel. And judging by his desperate pleas, he had been trying to convince her to leave me. But I knew Laura. She wasn't the kind of woman who wanted to deal with the mess of starting over on her own. If I had to guess, she probably told Daniel that she couldn't just walk away, that it wasn't that simple. Not because she loved me, no, that much had been clear for a long time, but because leaving meant untangling our lives, explaining things to Emily, stepping into the unknown. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, I realized something with absolute certainty. My marriage was over. I had spent the last year holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Laura would remember the love we once had. That she would snap out of this cold, bitter version of herself and come back to me. But now I understood. She didn't love me anymore. She was in love with someone else but too afraid to make the leap. And considering Daniel was also married, I wondered if he was hesitating too. Either way, I was done waiting. I was done being the target of her resentment, her anger, her indifference. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to clarity. I wasn't going to fight for something that had already been lost. I wondered if Laura actually believed Daniel would leave his wife for her. Did she think she was special enough for him to upend his entire life? Or was she just fooling herself the same way she had fooled me? I considered my options carefully, weighing every possible move before taking action. 3 days later, on a Thursday, Laura finally called me. It was the first time I had heard from her all week. I had been expecting an explanation, maybe even some kind of awkward attempt at small talk, but instead, all she wanted was for me to send her a few things from her desk. I asked why she couldn't just wait until she got home, but she snapped back with one of her usual sarcastic remarks about my so-called lack of concern for her. Typical. I reluctantly agreed, but I wasn't ready to say anything yet. I was still waiting for my investigator's report. I had contacted him the day after I found the letters, needing confirmation before I confronted her. When the report finally came in, I sat down across from my investigator as he flipped through the file. Daniel owns a car dealership, he began. Spends most of his time there during the day, seems to be doing well for himself. He has a nice home in the suburbs, probably worth $500,000 or more. His wife stays home, takes care of the house. Their oldest kid is in grad school, the rest still live at home. He slid a photograph toward me. A tall man with dark hair, well-dressed, decent-looking but more on the lean side than muscular. Like I told you before, the investigator continued, he spent the weekend at a hotel with your wife. The rest of the time he was at home with his family. Only went out one night during the week, Wednesday. Met your wife at a restaurant. They were affectionate, a lot of touching. Then he left alone and she drove straight home. He hesitated for a moment before adding, I overheard their conversation. She was making plans to meet him again this weekend. I thanked him for his work, took the file and left. I had the proof now. I had everything I needed. For years I had built my life around words. Contracts, negotiations, the carefully constructed language of corporate law. Words had power. Words could manipulate, deceive, twist reality into something more convenient. But I didn't want to use words against her. I didn't want to outsmart her. I wanted her to hurt. I wanted her to suffer. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the pain I had felt reading those letters, hearing that report, realizing the depth of her betrayal. When the phone rang again, I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang a second time. I picked up. She's not here, I said coldly. Call back later. Then I slammed the phone down, seething with anger. Screw her. Let her feel my contempt. It was only seconds before the phone rang again. I let the phone ring 5, maybe 6 times before finally picking up. I answered the same way. She's not here. There was a pause before Laura's voice came through, dripping with irritation. What the hell do you think you're doing hanging up on me? How dare you? Her anger only fueled mine. I told you Emily isn't here. What part of that didn't you understand? She huffed, her tone shifting. Calm down. I'm not angry now that you're being respectful. I let out a dry laugh. Respectful? That's rich coming from you. She ignored my remark. Why do you sound so cold? I'm your wife. I just wanted to talk to you. Why wouldn't I call? Don't you miss me at all? I could hear the expectation in her voice, as if she truly believed I'd been sitting here, longing for her return. Actually, Laura, it's been pretty peaceful since you left, I said, my voice steady. No yelling, no constant demands, no disrespect. Emily's happy, spending time with her friends. And I've been doing what I want, without you breathing down my neck. She scoffed, but before she could say anything, I continued. You know, I added, I bet Daniel misses you though. After all, that was the whole point of this little trip, wasn't it? To visit your mother? I let the word hang in the air. I'm sure he's been enjoying your company. So why rush back to this so-called loveless marriage, when you could make him happy a little longer? Silence. Then, just as I expected, she exploded. But I didn't give her the chance to spew whatever excuse she had lined up. I slammed the phone down before she could get a word in. This time I wasn't just hanging up. I was done. I pulled the phone cord from the wall, hearing the distant ring from the bedroom and den. Let them ring. They were too far away to be a problem. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my cell phone and switched it off. I wanted nothing more to do with her. And the silence? That was the best thing she'd ever given me. The next morning, I didn't hear from Laura again until lunchtime the next day. She sent a brief message saying her mom wanted to stay a few extra days, so she'd be extending her trip. Emily seemed pleased when I told her, and I kept my response short. Before I left the house, I went into the bathroom, pulled off my wedding ring and tied it to a piece of string. I hung it from the mirror, making sure it was the first thing she'd see when she eventually decided to come home. I didn't expect her to leave Daniel right away, but when she did walk through that door, I wanted her to understand there was no coming back from this. And more importantly, I didn't want to wear any reminder of her ever again. A much-needed distraction. Later that night, I met up with an old friend, Carmine. He was one of those guys who never sugar-coated anything, and that's exactly what I needed. We sat at the bar, nursing our drinks, when I finally told him the truth. She's been cheating on me, I admitted. Carmine's face darkened. Yeah. He set his glass down with a little too much force. How long? Over a year, I said bitterly. Some guy in Cleveland. And her mother helped cover it up, made a fool out of me. Carmine shook his head, muttering under his breath. Real pieces of work, those two. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling between us. Then he slid a fresh bottle toward me. Here, he said. You need this more than I do. I poured myself another drink, feeling the burn in my throat, but for the first time in a while, I didn't feel entirely alone. That was when I noticed her. Across the bar sat a woman, not young, not someone looking for attention, but someone with depth. She had a confidence about her, a quiet elegance that made her stand out from the crowd. I caught her eye and offered a small smile. Hello there, I said. She tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. Hello yourself. Her voice was smooth, self-assured. I leaned in slightly. And you are? Rachel, she said. Rachel English. Well, Rachel English, I replied. I'm James. I let my eyes linger on hers. And you are very beautiful. Her smile was worth more than any words, and I found myself wanting to keep her smiling. I searched my tired brain for something more. What's a woman like you doing alone in a place like this? I asked. She raised an eyebrow, amused. You think I came here looking for someone? I chuckled. I don't know. But I'm definitely interested in what happens next. For the first time in a long time, I felt something different. Something real. I woke up the next morning in an unfamiliar bed, disoriented and alone. It took me a moment to piece everything together, to remember where I was and how I got here. Then I saw her. Rachel stood by the door, holding a tray with 2 cups of coffee, wearing a thin negligee that barely concealed anything. My interest in coffee disappeared instantly. She set the tray down, and as soon as her hands were free, I reached for her. She didn't hesitate, she came willingly, melting into my arms as our lips met in a kiss that felt like it lasted forever. It wasn't just passion. It was something deeper, something raw. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Later, as we lay together in the warm morning light, Rachel sat up, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. She looked so youthful, so full of life. When I found you last night, you were already pretty far gone, she said softly. But the more we talked, the more I liked you. And I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. She turned to look at me, her expression open and honest. That's why I invited you to stay with me. I wasn't looking for just a meaningless night. I wanted to share something real with someone for the first time since my husband died. And you were that someone. She smiled a little wistfully. It was everything I hoped it would be. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet. Eventually, I pulled myself out of bed and went to the kitchen to pour myself a cup of coffee. As I sipped it, I noticed the blinking light on the answering machine. I checked the call log. 10 missed calls. All from Laura's cell phone. And one more, this one from a number I knew well. Paul. Laura's father. That one caught my attention. Paul and I had always had a good relationship, talking often enough for me to recognize his number immediately. Something about him reaching out now, after everything, made my gut tighten. I pressed play. His voice came through, calm but firm. Jim, it's Paul. When you get this, call me back. Pause. Then a sigh. Laura and her mother have gone up to the cabin for a few days. I was the one who convinced them to go. I needed them out of here. Another pause. I'm furious with both of them. And you know part of the reason why. All I know is that Laura has been having an affair with a man named Daniel Matthews. I think it started on her last trip home, or maybe even before that. And just so you know, I'm fairly certain Ruth was aware of it all along. In fact, I believe she was the one who sent those love letters to Laura's house. Silence. Then finally, that's all I know, Jim. The message ended. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the machine, the weight of it all pressing down on me. So Ruth had known. Laura's mother had helped cover up her daughter's betrayal. She had encouraged it, protected it, maybe even pushed Laura deeper into it. And now, after all of this, Laura still wanted to come home? Paul had to convince her to leave town just to give me some breathing room. A few minutes later, Paul called again. This time I picked up. I'm driving up there tonight, he said. I need to talk to them both and I thought you should know. Do you want to speak to Laura? I didn't hesitate. No, I said flatly. I have nothing to say to her. Not now. Maybe not ever. Paul didn't argue. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own life. I needed time to think. Paul understood and we ended the call without another word. About an hour later, Emily came home. I didn't want to waste time sugarcoating things, so I sat her down and told her everything I knew about her mother's affair. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of respect. Emily was growing up fast, and she had every right to know what was happening in her own family. I wasn't going to hide the truth from her. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she swallowed hard and said, I need to talk to Mom first. I nodded. She walked outside, settling herself on the porch. I hated that she had to deal with something like this, but she had her own life to live. What happened between Laura and me would inevitably affect her, so she deserved to have a say in it. I was still deep in thought, trying to decide how I wanted to handle things moving forward, when Emily stepped back inside. She held the phone out to me. Here, Dad. It's her, she said, her voice tight. I didn't take it. I don't want to talk to her, I said simply. Emily's eyes welled up with tears. She set the phone down on the table and left the room without another word. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I knew she needed space. Just like I did. After a long pause, I finally picked up the phone. Laura was still there waiting. I take it she didn't want to talk to me either, she said quietly. No, I replied. And can you blame her? I could hear her exhale sharply. I didn't want her to find out like this. That's not really up to you, Laura, I said flatly. What you did affects both of us, but it also affects her. She deserved to be treated with the respect you've denied me all this time. There was a long silence. Finally she spoke, her voice hesitant. Do you hate me, James? I sighed. No, I don't hate you, I admitted. To be honest, I don't feel much of anything when I think of you anymore. The last 2 years have killed whatever love I had left. She sniffled. I know I've done something awful, but maybe we can work this out? I'll make it up to you if you just give me the chance. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I don't want to work it out, Laura. I'd actually prefer if you stayed away for a while longer. The last few days have been peaceful for me, and I intend to keep it that way. She was quiet again, then asked, What about Emily? She'll decide for herself, I said. I won't pressure her either way. But considering she only has a year left before college, she'll probably stay here with me. Laura started to say something else, but I didn't want to hear it. I hung up. I was done. And the more the reality of her betrayal settled in, the clearer that became. The next week passed quietly and I threw myself into work, avoiding any thoughts of Laura. Then, on Wednesday just before noon, my secretary rang my office line. James, she said, her tone cautious. Your wife is here. I exhaled slowly, already knowing this conversation wasn't going to end well. 2 days had passed since I made it clear I wasn't accepting any calls from Laura, so when my phone rang and my secretary told me it was her, I was caught off guard. I thought I told you not to put her through, I said. I didn't, she replied. It was forwarded from Margaret Wilson's office. Margaret. I had completely forgotten that my personal line at work could still be forwarded through my old assistant. With a sigh, I picked up the call. Laura's voice was soft, almost pleading. James, please come home and talk to me. I owe you an explanation and I promise, no lies, no excuses. Just the truth. I clenched my jaw. The truth? I scoffed. What do you really want, Laura? Someone to take care of you while you run around doing whatever you please behind my back? Isn't that what you've been doing for the past 2 years? She inhaled sharply, but I didn't stop. You've treated me like garbage, I continued. Refused to communicate, made my life miserable, And then you went to him. You said you were visiting your mother, but that was just another lie. You went to him instead. You made plans to spend the weekend with him. And don't even think about denying it. Silence. The weight of the truth was finally pressing down on her. I wasn't finished. And what about your last trip? I pressed. You had quite the moment in that parking lot, didn't you? Are you going to deny that too? Still nothing. I could almost hear her struggling to find the words, but there were none. Did you and Daniel ever talk about his kids? I asked, my voice calm but cutting. What about his twins? Did he mention them? And his wife, Margaret? Did the two of you laugh about how you were pulling the wool over our eyes? That's when she broke. A choked sob erupted from her, the sound of someone who had finally been backed into a corner. But I wasn't moved by her tears. For 2 years she had made my life miserable. Now it was her turn to sit with the pain. I had spent the last week thinking about how to handle things, and I had made up my mind. Daniel wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. He could keep Laura, I didn't care. But I did care about holding him accountable for his actions. I wanted his wife to know what kind of man he truly was. I wanted his children to understand the kind of father they had. And most importantly, I wanted to drag him into court. He was a man who had spent years manipulating people, bending the rules to suit himself. But the law had a way of catching up with men like him. I handed the stack of letters to one of my associates and gave him clear instructions. Prepare a motion for handwriting analysis. I want these letters officially tied to Daniel Matthews. After all, it wasn't just about me. He had made a fool of his own family too. Later that evening, I walked into the family room to find Emily sitting on the couch, red-eyed from crying. Laura sat beside her, looking little better. As soon as Emily saw me, she jumped up and ran straight into my arms, holding me tightly. She leaned in, whispering softly, "Good luck, Dad. Whatever happens, I love you." I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. No matter how much my marriage had fallen apart, at least one thing remained true. Emily and I still had each other. And that was more than enough. I watched Emily walk away, her head held high, even though her quickened pace betrayed the pain she was in. She was strong. Stronger than her mother had ever been. And that thought at least gave me some peace. She would be okay, no matter what happened next. I sighed, running a hand down my face. It was late, and I knew the conversation with Laura wasn't over. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if there was even a point in continuing it. Still, I listened as she spoke. "I didn't expect it to happen," she admitted. "That first night when I met him, I was swept away. It had been so long since I'd felt that way about anyone, even with you. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. I know now that it was wrong," she continued, her voice unsteady. "But by the end of the evening, I wanted him. I wanted him badly." She hesitated, then added, "You know, we hadn't been intimate for months before I went home. I thought I had lost that part of myself completely. My drive, my desire, it was gone. But that night with him, it came back. And he saw it. He saw me in a way I hadn't felt seen in years. So he took me to a motel and we spent the night together." She lowered her head, staring at her hands. I woke up the next morning drowning in shame. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral. While I believed her shame was real, I believed nothing else. Not her supposed love for me, not her excuses, not her fear of me finding out. None of it rang true. "Well," I said, my voice flat, "that's quite a story, Laura." I leaned back in my chair, meeting her gaze. "Why don't I believe a word of it?" She flinched. I didn't give her a chance to respond. "I'll tell you why," I said coldly. "First, you shut me out long before you even left. You had already started treating me like an afterthought, and I felt it. Second, I know what you did with him. I know the things you were willing to do for him, things you would never even consider doing with me." Her breath hitched, but I wasn't finished. "Why is that, Laura?" I asked, tilting my head. "Was it him that made you feel different? Or was it simply the thrill of betrayal?" She didn't answer. I scoffed. "You think I don't see the bigger picture?" I continued. "Your mother has always despised me. She never cared about what this would do to our family. But she also never cared about his wife or his children. She must have known Margaret would eventually find out, that his entire marriage would be destroyed. But she didn't care. She didn't care about our marriage either. And you let her lead you straight down the path of betrayal without a second thought." I shook my head. "It was too easy for you, Laura," I said quietly. "Too easy for you to betray me and everything we built. And that's why I know it wasn't just him, it was you all along." She opened her mouth, but I had nothing left to hear. Laura Schwann, the wife of James Schwann, was gone. That role was over. I had already started the process to take my name back, to legally separate myself from the woman sitting across from me. What she didn't know yet was how I planned to deal with Daniel. I had made my decision and there was no turning back. I had meant to be out of the house by now, but everything had happened so quickly. I would sleep in the spare room until things were finalized. Then finally I'd be free. I looked Laura in the eye, my voice firm and unwavering. I'm moving out. You better stay away from me and don't talk to me. Emily knows everything, so don't try to spin this in your favor. She understands exactly what you've done. But Laura wasn't listening. She never really listened. I turned and headed upstairs, ready to start packing the last of my things when the sound of her phone ringing made me pause. She answered, and within seconds I could tell who was on the other end. My wife is suing me for $1 million, Daniel's voice practically screeched through the phone. Laura's eyes widened. What? She gasped. Oh my God. I knew she found out, but I didn't think she'd take it this far. Then I heard something unexpected, a stifled laugh. Laura shook her head, amusement laced in her voice. Sorry Daniel, but this is out of my hands. I guess you'll finally have to tell your wife the truth. Looks like your broken marriage is really about to break now, isn't it? Daniel must have tried to plead with her, but she wasn't having it. You lied to me, she spat. After all the things you told me, about how much you hated your wife, how you were filing for divorce, how miserable you were. You deserve every bit of this, so go to hell. She slammed the phone down. I watched her, unimpressed. A wife and 5 kids, and that's who you threw everything away for? Trust me, Laura, he's going to pay, as much as I can get out of him. And Margaret? I've already offered to help cover her divorce if she decides to go through with it. I scoffed. Maybe if you play your cards right, you can marry him when she finally kicks him out. She spun to face me, her expression desperate now. You know better, she insisted. I don't love him. I don't even like him anymore. He lied to me about everything. Him and my mother, I hate them both. Her voice cracked as she looked at me with the same pleading expression she used to get whenever she wanted something. Can't you just forgive me? She whispered. Can't we fix this? I didn't answer. Because there was nothing left to fix. Justice comes full circle. A few days later, John, Margaret's husband, met me at my office posing as a client. We spent hours talking, going over the details, and by the time he left, he was ready to move forward with his case. I introduced him to 2 of the most aggressive attorneys I knew, and they wasted no time setting things in motion. 5 days later, Ruth, Laura's mother, was served with legal papers at her home. The moment she saw them, she snapped. Right in front of the process server, Ruth charged at Margaret, spewing insults, completely losing control. The process server immediately called 911, and within 15 minutes, Ruth was in handcuffs, sitting in the back of a police car. I personally helped John secure a restraining order against her. She wouldn't be interfering in his life or his children's lives again. As for me, the court granted me full custody of Emily. She was given the chance to state her preference, and without hesitation, she chose to stay with me. Laura was given visitation rights, but it was clear Emily had no real interest in rebuilding their relationship. Every time her mother came by, Emily would make a quick excuse and leave the room. Laura finally understood. She was no longer welcome in the life she had destroyed. In the last 2 years, she had aged visibly, her once sharp confidence eroded by the weight of her choices. She had started experiencing health issues, and from what I heard, she was more alone than ever. Meanwhile, I was preparing for something new. Rachel and I were getting married. And Emily would be right there by my side.